Hi, good afternoon, morning, wherever you are. We're coming from the Mark Twain House, and who have very nicely invited us to talk about Lizzie Pook's new book, and I'll get it right here, Maude Horton's Glorious Revenge. Um, our normal moderator, Omar, is having a little bit of technical trouble, so Lizzie and I are going to wing it today. I'm Shelley Noble. I'm the author of The Tiffany Girls, most lately, about the turn of the 20th century women who worked in the Tiffany Glass Company and were responsible for those beautiful lamps and windows we all know under the Tiffany name. I also write historical mysteries and whoops, whoops, historical mysteries and also contemporary women's fiction. And Lizzie is from Twickenham today, and she will tell us a little bit about herself, and then we'll start grilling her with some questions about her new book. Lizzie?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. It's really lovely to be able to speak to you, Shelley. I'm very impressed. Haven't you written something like 16 novels or something like that? I'm in awe.
More. I stopped counting. I started in like amateur sleuth mystery, so those were under a different name and a different life.
Yeah. Yeah. So my name is Lizzie Pook. I am an author and also a travel journalist. So in my day job as a travel journalist, I write about quite adventurous remote places and wildlife for places like Lonely Planet, Condé Nast Traveller, The Times here in London, and more. Maude Horton's Glorious Revenge. This is the UK cover. Shelley, you've got the US cover, haven't
Yes.
you? Um,
Wait, hold it up again. We'll do a
yeah.
comparison.
Maude Horton's Glorious Revenge is my second novel. My debut was Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter, which was set on the west coast of Australia. And Shelley, I can go through the blurb of the book and explain what that is about if you'd like, and then we can start.
I mean, we can do that, certainly.
Okay, so for people who don't know what Maude Horton's Glorious Revenge is about, I'm just quickly going to read the very brief blurb on the back of the UK cover. London, 1850. Constance Horton has disappeared. Maud, her older sister, knows only that Constance abandoned the apothecary they call home and, disguised as a boy, boarded a ship bound for the Arctic. She never returned. A tragic accident, the Admiralty called it, but Maud Horton knows something isn't right. When she finds Constance's Arctic journal, it becomes clear that the truth is being buried by sinister forces. To find answers and deliver justice for her sister, Maud must step into London's dark underbelly and into the path of dangerous, powerful men. The kind of men who seek their fortune in the city's horrors, from the hangings at Newgate to the ghoulish waxworks of Madame Tussauds. It's a perilous task, but Maud has dangerous skills of her own. Just a taste.
Just a taste. I was going to ask you to read a passage because it is so vibrant and full of atmosphere, the whole book. But I want to start at sort of at the beginning. As you're a journalist, a travel writer, and now a women's historical fiction writer, I would call it. Been to so many exotic places. Is that how you started thinking about fiction? It's like, oh, I want to do more of this and more of this and more of this, or did it just hit you one day that you saw something or heard something that made you want to expand on that?
I definitely am inspired by place and love writing about landscape and love writing evocatively about how it feels to be in a particular place. So the books that I write, I try to set them somewhere I've actually been. So my first novel, as I said, Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter, is actually about pearl diving and the history of pearl diving on the west coast of Australia, which was a very dangerous, brutal business. You know, these divers were forced to dive and they got swept up in storms. There were shipwrecks. They were stalked by crocodiles, and their air hoses got caught up in the flukes of whales. And so that was a sort of history that I stumbled across while I was traveling, and wanted to delve in further, and so then created this sort of historical mystery with a female character at its center based on that history. Similarly, with Maud Horton's Glorious Revenge, I have been lucky enough to travel a fair bit in the Arctic, particularly the very remote east coast of Greenland, and parts of Norway and Northern Iceland and things like that. But this book actually came about during the pandemic because I, like so many other people,
Me too.
was trapped inside, trapped indoors, sort of yearning for adventure, dreaming of far off places. And I started reading historical accounts of Arctic adventures and explorers seeking what we call the Northwest Passage. And that is the elusive sort of ice-choked trade route at the top of Canada, through the Arctic islands, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And, you know, I was stuck indoors. I was going through a period of poor health. I'd lost my travel writing job overnight, basically, because nobody could travel. I became sort of swept up in these stories of polar bears and northern lights and, you know, ships splintering in the ice as they tried to make this this Northwest Passage route. And that's when I decided, okay, I might as well write a book set somewhere adventurous if I can't actually go there. And so that's where the Arctic sort of side of the novel
I was
from.
wondering if you had written that during the pandemic, because the Tiffany Girls I also wrote during the pandemic.
Did you?
And
Yeah.
luckily I was familiar with his work, so I could, between Google and my imagination. But that must have been so aggravating to be stuck. I mean, it was a horrible thing that happened, but what did you like pour your travel energies into? Was just the research of the Arctic? Was
Yeah, research. And I find books and TV shows so immersive that I was able to sort of travel
yeah.
in that way. And I was also in a real just twist of luck, found out that a family friend had a relative who had been on a ship that had been up to the Northwest Passage.
Oh,
And
serendipitous.
she said, oh, I've got his diaries in my attic. He was called George Brown, and he was out on a ship called the Investigator. And she let me read the diaries. And it was just so fascinating to have that link to somebody who'd actually been up to the Northwest Passage in search of Sir John Franklin. I should say that the Arctic passages in the book are about Constance disguising herself as a cabin boy to board a ship called the Makepeace, which is traveling up to the Northwest Passage in search of Sir John Franklin, who was a lost
Could you just
and
give us a little background for people who are not versed in what the Northwest Passage was so important and what Franklin did and why the Makepeace was
yeah.
there looking for him?
So it was a lot of people wanting to win. You know, at that point, there were lots of different nations competing to be the ones to make the Northwest Passage. And there was a quite famous British explorer and war hero called Sir John Franklin. And he took two ships called Terror and Erebus up to the Northwest Passage, and it was a very well sort of publicized expedition. The newspapers wrote all about it. There was sort of this real frenzy about it. Thousands gathered to sort of wave them off when they set off for their expedition. And essentially what happened is those men got lost. They were last sighted by some whalers in Baffin Bay, and then nobody heard from them again. So in the sort of following years, there were a number of expeditions to go and try and find Sir John Franklin and his missing men, and to find out what happened to him. And it was only a few years later that it became clear that they had met a grisly end, let's just say. Their ships had got frozen in the ice, and they were forced to land at them and cross the tundra in search for the Canadian mainland.
Many ships, I would assume, had been lost.
Yes. And it ended up, you know, there was some cannibalism, let's just say, you know, and so it's quite a famous failed expedition, but certainly lots of ships went out in search of them. And so that's what my ship, the Makepeace, is doing.
Wow. So you know you're going to do a story about this. I'm already off my script. I had lovely questions. So naturally you would pick a place that was completely the opposite of Victorian London to place the dual setting of this story. I mean,
Yes,
it's just the opposite. I mean, it's dank, it's dark,
yes.
it's overcrowded, it's claustrophobic, it's dangerous, but in a very different way.
I know, and I think, you know, when you first hear about the book, it sounds like such a stark contrast. However, the reason I did it is because, as I said, we're in this pandemic. I'm spending a lot of time sort of researching ideas, working out what to write about, what to do with my time. The same time that as I was researching all this Arctic stuff, I stumbled across an article in the digital archives of the British Library. And I can't even remember how I got onto it because it was an article about the history of public executions in Victorian England. I can't even imagine, I can't even work out how I stumbled upon that
What a
thing.
combination.
However, I was reading it, and in it, it alleged that the early tours of Thomas Cook, which was a big travel company here in the UK, it alleged that the early tours of Thomas Cook involved taking people around the country to witness public hangings, which at that time, around sort of
Was
1850,
very popular.
were these huge, you know, spectacles. They were sort of almost carnivalesque events, and there were all sorts of ways that people monetized them. You know, people, tavern owners raised the price of their rooms that had views of the gallows, so people could stay there and you know, see the grisly sight from there. Or they put on execution breakfast so people could fill their stomachs before they watched these executions.
I'll
But
never look at Thomas Cook tour again the
oh,
same
I
way.
know. And I have to say alleged because it did happen. However, there's no concrete evidence that Thomas Cook was the first one to do it. So I have to say alleged. But they certainly did. There were special excursion trains put on so people could travel to the sites of public hangings and watch them. But all this was taking place in the context of what we can call murder mania. You know, Victorian England at that time was gripped in this sort of fervor and this obsession with crime and punishment that we still have today, you know, with true crime podcasts, popularity of those, and documentaries and things like that. But I did find a parallel with the ways in which the Franklin expedition was written about in the papers. You know, people were sort of clamoring after stories of struggle and darkness and what had happened to these men in the, you know, in the ice, lost among these really dangerous, hostile conditions. And so it might seem like a really odd sort of parallel, but I could find this sort of similarity in the way that people are obsessed about reading stories about these things. So you have this murder mania and you have this sort of Arctic expedition mania going on at the same time. And so
there's such danger of different kinds, but that draws the two together, definitely.
yes, exactly. And that's why people like reading about them.
Sensationalism sells
Exactly.
always for years, decades, for centuries. Wow. So okay, so I think both of your books have been called, let me see what it's called, feminist adventure stories. You want to comment on that? I mean, are
Yeah,
you?
you know what? I'll take that. I think that's okay. And I think it's fair because they both involve placing female characters at the center of a narrative that would typically be male. So in Moonlight, the Pearler's Daughter, we've got Eliza Brightwell, who ends up going out on a ship in search for her missing father. And Maud Horton's Glorious Revenge, we've got Constance, who, yes, has disguised herself as a cabin boy to board this ship, but she still is a woman, you know, surrounded by men and sort of rubbing up against the difficulties that you know brings.
Did you find research about, I mean, because you always hear about, you know, women in the Civil War being doctors, and it's like it seems almost incomprehensible how they could actually pull it off. I mean, it's one thing if you're in London being a doctor in your office, but in the field.
I know, but it did happen. There's
it
a woman,
did.
called Isabel Gunn, and she disguised herself as a man to become part of the Hudson Bay Company. And she ended up on a ship surrounded by men. And she was
She got,
disguised as a man, passed off for a long time, and there are stories of that happening. It was an interesting one to write,
yeah.
and try and how she would experience that actually as a woman but disguised as
Yeah.
a man. But yes, it's got its roots in history. It did happen.
I think, I mean, I love the adventure part of it. I mean, because it's, I mean, the Arctic and London. We all love Victorian London because of all the things you've heard and read about it. And they're both so big they actually become characters. But in addition to that, these stories I think are character driven because you have these two sisters that I want you to expound on. If you want to, I don't know, do you want to read a passage of anything just because to get a feel for your language, because your sentences are just so full of
Thank you.
stuff, writerly stuff.
Let me find. Okay.
I didn't mean to spring this on you, but I'm
No,
doing
that's
it
okay.
anyway.
That's okay. I've got a passage here that I've
Yes.
read before, and I've turned down the page, so that's very handy.
Yeah, I have a couple too.
This is a passage set in the Arctic. So Constance is aboard the ship, and she's getting used to what life is like, aboard this very cramped ship full of men. As she's disguised on the ship, the name she assumes is Jack Aldridge. So the journals are called the Journal of Jack Aldridge. The Whalefish Islands, Disco Bay, Greenland, 2nd of July, 1849. Men do not decide the direction in which a ship will sail, nor are men at liberty to determine the speed at which it moves. The ice decides. There are men on the makepeace with strange, surprising preoccupations. The young stoker's assistant, Baker, who is cultivating a cress farm in the bend of a warm galley pipe. Mansfield, the long-faced clerk in charge, who befuddles the men by speaking ornate Latin at dinner. Yet none are as mysterious to me as those whose job it is to converse with the ice. They are conductors atop the mainmast who maneuver their scopes with frostbitten fingers, translating the ice's wily, wordless orders. The way they speak among themselves sounds to me like singing, not a melodic choral hum, but something guttural, thick as a shanty. Sludge ice, they murmur, brash ice, drift ice, speaking to the staccato beat of a drum. The ice master, however, the man in charge of navigating this entire frozen expanse, is a plain brute. Seaman Abel Mance, rough as rocks and with eyes that have certainly never troubled themselves to smile. They say he spent years working among walrus hunters in the north, guiding them through the narrowest leads in the ice, helming wooden boats dripping with blood through floes and drifts. He's a man of few words, I have judged. He takes his meals with the scientific officer, Stowe, who appears lofty and supercilious against the ice master's base brutality. It is not so uncommon for such bonds to be forged on a ship like this, though, especially when those of all stripes are hemmed in so close together. I watch them sometimes, one dirty, one clean, Mance in his stained canvas breeches, Stowe with the holy shine of an officer, polished calfskin boots and cut-away worsted coat, no marks. When I pass him in the companionway on my way to assist Mr. Penny in the galley, he smells always of pomade and antiseptic. Mance smells most detestably of crotch rot. Stowe picks at his food like a bird while Mance tears into flesh in the manner of an old starved dog. I'll stop there so it's not too long, but that also gives you a glimpse into the antagonist of our story.
Right. And that's so Arctic. I mean, there's something crisp and clean. I want you to do another one. You can do it later, but on Victorian London, do you have one of those? So
Sure.
you want to do it now? I just like
I'll
the
find one in a bit.
juxtaposition. Sorry.
I'll find one in a bit.
Okay. All right. So we have these two sisters. One longs for adventure. The other is content to have her quiet life helping out at her grandfather's chemist shop, which is a whole nother thing about what you know about herbs and things. And she's content to stay there. And yet you put them both in their extremist positions. Do you want to talk about how they came to you and just a little bit about them, and we'll sort of pick at them for a while?
Yeah, so when I wrote the first draft of the book, it actually wasn't about sisters. It was about Maud and a lover who had died on the ship, and she was, she was trying to find out what had happened to him. And I just wasn't connecting to it emotionally. I wasn't invested enough in it
Mhm.
emotionally. And I thought, I think that's because I'm not taking inspiration from the most important relationship to me. And so I am an identical twin. I have an identical twin sister,
Really? Wow.
and we have a really strong bond. And she's probably the only person I can imagine disguising myself as a boy for and traveling out to the Arctic for. So I thought, no, do you know what? I think actually this is more of a sort of love story between sisters.
Mm.
And so I did want them to be very different. And yes, we have Constance, who is the younger sister, and she's reckless and ambitious and abandons her life in London for reasons that become clear in the book, thinking she's doing the right thing, but also yearning for adventure and heading out to the Arctic. And then, yes, we've got steady, sensible Maud, who has sort of rooted herself to that life in the apothecary, looking after her grandfather and her younger daughter after both their parents have died. But I wanted to test both those sisters. I wanted to, as you say, put them into the two different extremes and see how they behaved when, the stakes really got
Mhm.
really high. And so it was interesting to see how far I could push Maud, who was, who is this very sensible, reluctant, risk-averse person who ends up having to descend into this murder mania of Victorian London
Yeah.
in order to uncover the truth about her, what happened to her sister. And I think only that sort of really strong familial love can fuel you to do that. And so that's what I wanted to explore.
Yes, and she reluctantly, I would think, but at some point, Maud even becomes more aggressive rather than passive.
Yeah,
Not,
I wanted there to be a
yeah,
sort of hardening of Maud, but I wanted it to be realistic.
yeah,
Yes, she has doubts about stepping into this sort of
yeah,
dangerous world at first, but then you can sort of start to understand why she's putting herself in that position. And then as things unravel, as she becomes more sure of what's happened to Constance and angrier and more fueled by this desire for revenge for her sister, then yes, she starts to almost take on more aspects of Constance, her very adventurous, reckless
yeah,
sister, and apply them to themselves and
yeah.
push herself to the limit.
And becomes in a way even not more ruthless, but more pinpointed to what her, they almost switch
Yes,
positions in a way by
yes,
the end of each
yes. I think
one.
it's this sort of meeting in the middle of the two,
Yeah,
but at
yeah.
least this explosion.
That was great. So you have two sisters. I don't really want to leave them yet, but let me see. We'll go on to the other point of view character, Edison Stowe, who we got a little bit of him in your reading. Constance, we learn her story in her journal entries. Maud is carrying the present story. Edison shows up not as a point of view character, but he shows up in both timelines because it's a dual timeline, and a year and a half apart. And I think it's interesting the way you don't have an Edison passage because to me, having read it, the Edison of the Arctic is just flip flop into a different Edison in the city, which was quite lovely. But how did you arrive at his character? Was he a composite of people? Was he based on somebody that was real or just a
So,
type of?
yeah, so just to explain a little bit, Edison is the scientific officer on the Makepeace. So Constance meets him while they're out in the Arctic, and his job on the ship, or his purported job on the ship, is to sort of gather scientific data while they're out there. However, she becomes suspicious of him, his odd behaviors, And yes, when we're in the London timeline, we actually get Edison's point of view, so we know what he's really, really like. He, for me, was the most interesting person to write because I wanted to give myself the challenge of creating an antagonist and a bad character who was also very nuanced and very complicated. And that was inspired by, actually, I was listening to a psychologist talk about really dangerous people. And she said that, yes, dangerous people can be, the really outwardly violent and aggressive people. However, sometimes really dangerous people are people who are very damaged and people who are very deluded. And that's certainly the case with Edison. And as the book goes along, we sort of learn where his badness has come from. And Edison is a person who will place his survival above everybody else's at all costs. He thinks he's better than everyone else. He thinks he deserves to live and
Yes, the victim
above anybody else. He sees himself as a victim, and and it's all sort of links back to his relationship with his mother when he was younger. And we do sort of find out that there are reasons why he has become as hardened and as sort of I will survive at all costs. And so he was just a really interesting person to write. And because I had these two different timelines and he had to appear slightly different in each timeline,
yes.
I gave him a number of different faces and masks. He's always putting up a front. He's always acting, as something that he's not, whether that's a scientific officer, whether that's somebody who's very wealthy or clever or, noble. But, really, as the book goes on, we know that he's an actor. He's a manipulative person, and he'll do whatever it takes to survive. And actually, that was a lot of fun to write because it was quite...
I thought you might have fun with that.
Quite freeing. And sometimes it's just fun to write bad people.
Yeah, it is. When he's in the Arctic, he appears supercilious and punctilious and all those things because of the raw nature and the brutality in a physical sense of the men and what it took to survive. And yet, put him in London, and he's not that at all. He's like one of those guys, only in civilization. Can you find a picture about London? I mean, a picture of a passage? Just because the Arctic and London are representative of so much that goes on in the book, just inside.
I'll read from the beginning.
Okay.
Which is a hanging.
Yes.
So an example of the hangings that I mentioned that were these busy events. Right. So the end of things. Newgate Prison, London, 17th of January, 1851. Let us begin at the end, shall we? In a cold London square, a murderer is to be hanged, and the fuss has lured the pigeons out in their hundreds. Cloaked in the fumes of cheap meat pies, the birds scratch around traders touting wares to the crowds. With silky silver green necks bobbing, they puff their chests in the manner of stout grandees, ducking hobnailed boots and scattered bottles as they squabble and they peck for a taste of scraps. Dung! The birds lift as one, dispersing into shards as the bell loudly tolls. Down below from debtor's door, a reluctant prisoner is led into the bitter air. An eel jelly smog hangs low over the Thames. The air is wet, breathing it like shrugging a damp greatcoat onto the body. Old Bailey is swarming with humans. The ripe sweat stink of 20,000 or so. Half of London, it seems, is here for the show, for there is nothing like a hanging to lure mankind out of his house. Just a short one, but
yes, that's a short one, but it's a good one.
Gives you a taste of.
Yes, it is, and the difference between the two young women and Edison and his group of compatriots in London is also very stark, and you can see the crossovers between human needs and human wants. Do you want to go into like, I don't know, I know there's this whole section with Madame Tussauds, and it's part of the same, it's part of the same ilk as murder mania.
Yeah, I can explain that a bit. So
Yeah,
in
because
1850,
we have a Madame Tussauds on 42nd Street, but it's nothing like.
well, yeah, so there may be some similarities. In 1850, if you visited Madame Tussauds, which was an incredibly popular attraction at that time, you could descend the stairs, cross through a thick black curtain, and you would enter something called the separate room or the Chamber of Horrors. And so that was a sort of hidden away room where women had to be chaperoned because it was sort of too dark for their sensibilities. And it was filled with souvenirs from some of the country's most famous or notorious murders. So poison bottles, weapons. They had a replica of the guillotine that was used in the French Revolution. They had wax heads of death masks taken from the French Revolution. They also had wax figures of some of the most famous murderers. So Burke and Hare, who were body snatchers. Well, we call them body snatchers, but they actually murdered people and sold their bodies to the anatomists. And famous serial killers that they had back then that you know, we can draw parallels with these days. But you know, that the Chamber of Horrors was controversial. There was a satirical magazine called Punch, and they accused Madame Tussaud of profiting from the abomination of blood. But anyway, it was another example of this murder mania that gripped people, and the idea that people would pay good money to get close to artifacts from murders, these stories of murderers. It was yes, it was sensationalist, but people paid good money for it.
Yeah.
And so in the book, the chamber, Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors serves as a backdrop for some of the action. And there is a Chamber of Horrors today at the London Madame Tussauds. They restarted it, so I don't know if you've got one where you are now, but
Yeah, well, I haven't been there for a while. I was at the London one 100 years ago, but this one it's great. It's wonderful, but it doesn't have the same impact that perhaps the original did. Did you end up feeling closer to one of the characters over the others? Not that you didn't like them best, but did you end up understanding and relating better to somebody over the others?
I hope you won't judge me.
Not me.
It was Edison. It was. And I think that's because, look, when you're creating a villain, you can't just create a flat villain.
Right.
You can't just have a pantomime villain that has no nuance to them. You have to find something in there for people to root for, or not root for, at least understand why they behaved the way that they did.
From the moment of meeting him, I kept saying, "There's a redeeming quality here somewhere. There's a redeeming quality. Really, there's a redeeming quality."
No redeeming quality. He's an awful person, but there are, you know, there are reasons why he acts like he does. So I became really invested in him. Not that I wanted him to be successful or for his story to end well, but I wanted to do his character justice. And so I think that's possibly why that happened. But you know, Maud is our character that we follow through the whole story.
Yes.
So, you know, I am and was really invested in her and her journey. And I hope others will be too. But it's really interesting writing, I find, different POV stories, because you can step into different
Yes, they're my favorite.
Keeps it fresh, yeah.
Yes, and it makes you have different feelings about you. If you stick with the same character, for me, and I sometimes do, is you grow with them, you know, and you don't get the other perspectives necessarily. So that, I mean, were there times when, like, did you get mad at Constance for, like, running off and leaving them to, you know, and did you think Maud was being stubborn not to? I mean, did you, like, start playing them, like, not against each other, but did you start pushing them to act out of?
Yeah, I think there were definitely times where I made Maud riskier than she should have been, because I just wanted her do what I would do perhaps in this situation. But she's not me. She is,
Yes.
a reserved and sensible person at the beginning of the book. But also that's the joy of writing POV characters, because if one of them's not doing what you want them to do, you can go to somebody else and see if they'll do it. I've yet to write a book that has one single point of view, and so I commend you for doing it, because you must have to really get so deep into their
I prefer it. Maybe it was being raised on television. I don't know, but I like that reaction that you don't get when you just have this on. Did any of them like throw you a curve when you think, sometimes it's really hard to sit down and get the scene out, and sometimes they just sail along for a minute. And then sometimes your characters trip you up. And do you remember that happening while you were writing Maude's story? Or
I do. And I think this must just be part of writing. There is a scene in the book, which you will know, Shelley, because you've read it, but other people won't. It's set out on the ice, and it's basically the end of Constance's story, and we learn how Constance actually died. That was not a scene that even came into the book until sort of several drafts into the book. And it really came out of nowhere. However, I had already unknowingly planted a key clue for that scene right in the beginning of the book, when in the sort of first couple of drafts. So it's almost like you have to draft and redraft until your brain catches up. You go, this actually is the scene. And so that's why I always say, you have to trust in the process of drafting and writing, and it's a laborious and it's long. But sometimes your subconscious will make those connections, and it will feel like your characters are surprising you. It will feel like, oh, my characters just did this and I had no idea they were going to do it. And it, sent everything into a spin. And your brain has set that seed down.
That's why, people who say you don't need to do so many drafts. Well, I guess it depends on what the kind of book you write and how complicated it is. But you do pick up things, and then why didn't I think, if I had thought about that months ago, this would have been a lot easier.
But that's just the way it works for me. I do multiple drafts, into the 20s. It's constant, redrafting. That's what I think writing a book is, having the patience to, keep your
actually redrafting is sort of my favorite part, because that's when it's already done, so you can go, oh, I'll pull this out, or I'll get rid of this. But is there a section in the final, or maybe something that you had to cut out, a sentence, a scene, a fragment of movement that you think is just so perfect, that just precious to you, and like nobody ever mentions it?
What do you mean, that I had to take out of the book, or
not necessarily that you had to take out, but just that, like, I have passages like of, especially during the Tiffany, of like these epiphanies with color and glass, that I think, oh, that was so beautiful. I wonder how you thought of that. Is that and nobody says, oh, that scene, oh yeah, I remember that. They're not as wowed as you are.
It's more that I have sort of side characters that I really love and I really have invested in, and I thought, oh, I hope people like this character, and then nobody mentions them again. So there's a secretary character in this book called Francis Hart, and he actually gives Maud Constance's diary. And he's a quirky little character, and he shows up again a little bit later in the book, and I really love writing him, but people don't care, they just
and the other characters are so strong. I mean, and he didn't really get as much page space as he deserved.
He amused me while I was writing him, so that's enough.
So and plus, then books would go. I mean, if we had our way, books would be 700 pages. Let me see, what else did I want to ask you? Oh dear, let's see. Oh, you know what? Let's do some. Everybody wants to know these things, so let's do this since we don't have Omar. I don't know if you're still there, but the way you work, everybody goes, how do you write a novel? Do you like sit down every day? Do you like go to a desk, or you afternoon with a tea on your couch, and how do you draft it? And give us a little bit about your process.
So Before I started writing a book, I thought that I would wait until the muse spoke to me. Then I would sit down when I was ready and the words would flow out. And that's not the case. And that's not how I find the process of writing at all. And actually, years ago, I was listening to an interview with an indie author called Shannon Mayer. And they asked her what her sort of best piece of advice was for writing. And she said, sorry, I'm about to swear. But she said, your muse is your bitch, basically. You know, you are in charge of your muse. You tell your muse when to clock in for work and when to show up by sitting in the seat, starting writing. And actually, that really shifted things for me. And I thought, actually, in order for something to be good, I don't have to have found it easy to write. So
No.
writing a first draft for me is a slog. It's often a slog.
Okay.
I do plan before I write a first draft, so I can have, you know, up to 30 pages of a plan. I will sort of just write out in a Word document what I think each chapter is roughly going to be, make sure I've got the structure sort of right. I
So
need
this is another question. Do you do your structure with your, I use storyboard, like a big one, like in the movies, in the old movies, because I like to be able to move things around. Did you structure Maud's book in the dual timeline or separately? As you
uh,
went?
I structured it, all the pieces together,
Mhm.
and then I put it on the wall, like you said. So
Yeah.
different post-it notes in a different color for each
Yes, that's the
character.
way I do.
And I will
It's
actually
great.
move the post-it notes up if it's a very active scene where there's lots of drama.
Mhm.
So I can check that there's sort of enough rises and falls
Yes, yeah, that's
that it's going to,
great
you know,
idea.
carry the momentum of a story. So yes, there's a lot of planning on paper and then on my wall, and then I'll, you know, spend, I don't know, a few months writing out this painstaking first draft, which is the bit I hate the most. I always think it's awful, but I
You've
have
read
to
them.
allow myself to write terrible words, because you can't edit a blank page, but you can edit
Yeah.
terrible words.
But before you were an author of long words, did it ever occur to you that people hated writing their first draft so much? It's like,
No, I don't think so, because I do, you know, as a journalist, my pieces were always relatively
yeah.
short.
I mean,
And
most people enjoy their first draft, but I think there are plenty of us who just, we know where we want to go. I've got scenes like ready to be plugged in when we get there, if we ever get there, but some days it's just hard. Do you make yourself write every day or every other
um,
day or?
uh, I write as often as I can. Um, I do have a chronic illness, and that can affect my energy levels. If I
Okay.
can't write, I can't write. I'm not going to beat myself up about it. However, I do try and think about the book every day.
Yeah.
You know, so that might just
It's
be,
called incubation.
yeah,
Sometimes you
call
just
it
need to
that.
think about it.
Yeah, yeah. So I certainly do try and sort of keep in touch with my book, otherwise I'll lose the grip on the story. But when I'm drafting, I try and write at least 1,000 words a day. I'll be, you know, I'll be really upset with myself if I don't reach that. Um, for the most recent book I've just drafted, it was 2,500 words a day. It just depends on the story and the
Yeah,
book
and
and
the
where you're
day
setting
and
and how much research is needed, whether you need to stop every second to go, oh, what's this part of a ship called?
yeah.
Or, you know,
Do you
something
go
like that.
ahead sometimes or do you always research as you go?
No, I do research first. I research first. I can spend a couple of months sort of really throwing myself into research.
That's my favorite part.
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely my favorite part too. Book-based research, but also travel-based research, or just really cool museums, or going to see
Yeah.
exhibitions, watching films, whatever I can to immerse myself in the story. And that's my favorite part too, because it hasn't started going wrong yet. You know,
Yeah.
you're
And it
just
hasn't been like
in that period of
staring at you from the empty page. Of course, if you keep your page from the day before up, you don't have to face the
yeah,
empty one.
yeah.
Let's see if we're supposed to be doing questions. Does anybody have a question out there? Let's see. Uh, I don't know if Omar's going to do this. I don't see any questions yet because we covered so much. Let's see. Well, how about telling us what's next, you know?
Well, I've actually written something slightly different for my next book. It's in a slightly different period of history. So both my first and second novels were sort of mid to late 19th century. The one I've just written is more of a thriller, but it's still about three women. It's still what you might call a feminist adventure
Yeah, I
story.
can guess that it's going to be character driven as well as thrilling.
Yeah. But I have so many stories buzzing around in my head, so many ideas. Ideas is never the difficulty for me. It's always that sort of slog of putting down that first draft and keeping going.
So, so one more, at least one more question. I have a couple actually. So, do you now look back? I mean, you're still doing travel writing, are you? More or less.
Not so much at the moment, because it's quite difficult to fit it in.
Yes.
But it
Yeah.
certainly has been a fantastic job that has provided a lot of inspiration. And I was
Okay.
actually supposed to be going out to the Northwest Passage,
Oh,
to go to, the exact place where Constance and Edison would have been, to see what that would have been like, and search for a narwhal, because that's an obsession of mine. And
well, that's
eventually,
what I was going to say. Now that you're writing novels, do you go back and or see someplace new and go, definitely got to be a novel, or great place for a murder, instead of going, this is a lovely place to visit. You're going,
oh,
kill, kill,
my
kill.
stories are always, what's the bad
Yeah,
things that could have happened here?
yeah,
But
yeah.
actually, I didn't end up going up to the Northwest Passage because the weather was too bad, and I ended up in an airport hotel in Canada for 5 days,
Oh dear.
yearning for
Well,
the Northwest Passage. But interestingly, that's what would have happened to so many people back then. It was such a
yeah,
hostile place. You just simply couldn't get up there if the conditions weren't
yeah,
right.
yeah.
And that's why so many ships turned around
I
and
was going to say better a hotel in Canada than on a ship.
well, yes, I think that's
And you
probably,
think, I mean, I'm sure it happens even now with GPS and all and the kind of ships there are, but I mean, things happen.
yeah,
It's sort of
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, it's a very
Oh,
dangerous part of the world, if it's not
yes,
the weather, it's the animals, it's the polar bears, it's the
yes.
yeah. I'll get out
Well,
there one day, but it remains my white whale, my elusive place that I've yet to visit, but I would love to go.
yeah. Well, yeah. Okay, we could go on. I wanted to do herbs and medicines, but I don't think we have time, and nobody had any questions. I think they were so floored with this wonderful title, Maud Horton's Glorious Revenge. It's on sale as of yesterday in the States, and it's already on sale in England, right?
1st of February in the UK.
Oh, not till February. So you have a treat coming up. Thank you for coming with us.
Thank you,
Uh,
everyone.
yes, thanks everyone. Thanks, Mark Twain House. Thanks, Omar. I'm sorry you didn't get to be a part of it today because it are always so much fun. And thank you, Lizzie, and hope you come again.
Thank you. And I'd just like to say, if anyone does have any questions or wants to contact me in any way, you just find me on Twitter or Instagram and send me a message that way, just at Lizzie Pook. But thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Shelley, for great questions.
Oh, I love talking about writing. I mean, you have to stop me. Thank you. It was a great time. And we will see you again soon, I hope. Thanks, Lizzie.